Let's get started. So hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're super excited you're here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation we're having with Caterine, author of Leaving Academia. I've got a copy of the book right here. And maybe we can throw in a link to your publisher page in the chat during the conversation. So just to give you an overview of what we're going to do today. So I'm going to start with a couple of introductions, and then I have some initial questions that will get the conversation started and open up a few avenues for further discussion. And then about 20 minutes or halfway through, we're going to open it up to Q&A. So we'd love to hear from you on what your questions are. We have a couple of pre-submitted questions, so we'll start with those. But then we'll be taking questions either if you want to go off mute and ask your question yourself, or if you prefer to submit your question by chat, I can ask the question for you. If you would like to ask the question yourself, please use the raise hand function. You've probably heard this a million times now, but it's in the participants section, and then you see the list of participants and you can raise your hand there. Or again, you can submit your question through the chat, either to me, Rachel Waxman, to Roshni, or to everyone, and we'll see it there. And you can go ahead and, if you know you're going to ask a question, you can go ahead and raise your hand at any point during the conversation, and I'll just keep a list going. Likewise, you can submit your question at any time. Great. So without further ado, let's jump in. So just very briefly, I'm Rachel Waxman. I'm a 7th year PhD candidate in the history department, and we're talking with Caterine. So Caterine began his professional life as a true believer in higher education who couldn't imagine a life outside the ivory tower. He earned his PhD in classics from the University of Virginia in 2014 and went on to work as a visiting assistant professor. Personal circumstances and growing doubts about the academic job market led Chris to explore new careers. Since 2017, he has worked days as a communications strategist and proposal writer for a global consulting firm, and nights as an advisor to academics seeking satisfying work in new sectors. This past September, he released his first book, Leaving Academia, A Practical Guide with Princeton University Press. I really enjoyed this book. I think it's been interesting to see how advice for people leaving academia has changed over the years, I think for the better. And one thing that really stood out for me in this book is it's full of very practical advice that I think you all will find useful about translating your skills to the professional context, how to write a resume. There's some really good resources on that in here. How to do informational interviews. I love there's kind of a sample of just an email you can send to ask somebody for their time that I found really helpful. At the same time, Chris's book addresses a lot of those like emotional conflicts of leaving academia that I think that many of us are familiar with. So for instance, one thing that I really appreciated was the book addresses the less talked about issue of those of us who kind of choose to leave academia. There's a lot of talk about, people kind of forced out of academia, there's no jobs, they couldn't find anything. But I think more and more people are recognizing that more of us really kind of feel like we want to leave academia, that we're kind of making a choice rather than being pushed out. So I thought that was an important part of this book. And finally, Chris's book is very open-minded about jobs in the private sector. Again, I think that's something that's new. A lot of times people talk about leaving academia and going into nonprofits or government work or university administration. There's a huge number of opportunities in the private sector. There's some great work being done there. And so this book really speaks to that. So let me just jump into some questions I have for you, Chris, just to kind of get started. So the first question I have is, why did you write this book? And what do you hope readers will take away from it? And also with this, maybe we can hear about your path out of academia.
When I first began thinking about leaving academia, I was really struck by the fact that advice that I found really fell into two camps. Either it was so practical and tactical that I felt like it didn't apply to me because I was somehow special as an academic, or I felt like, and this was kind of the heyday of quitlit being a genre, that it was just an awful lot of indulging in the sadness of leaving without actually telling you what to do about it. And so I felt like everything that I was finding was really on one of these two poles, and I wanted to find advice initially that actually acknowledged the difficulty of leaving academia, the peculiarities of adopting an academic mindset that we're all acculturated to have in a graduate program, or many of us are, and needing to give that up. With the pragmatics of, I mean, how do you just put one foot in front of the other when you don't know what you're getting into? You're entering a totally new world. And so that wasn't available when I was leaving. I largely had to figure that out myself by speaking to as many people as I could, both academics and non-academics. And then in the winter of, it was January of 2018, I was having lunch with some friends at an academic conference where I was doing a networking event for, or with former academics. And they said, you know, you should really write a book. You seem to have a good perspective on this. And yeah, they kind of convinced me over the course of lunch that maybe I should go ahead and do it. And really this book is that attempt to, speak to both the psychological challenges of leaving academia, but also to do so in a way that allows you to keep moving forward every step, no matter where you fall.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's amazing how just those conversations with friends can make exciting projects go forward. We're very glad that you wrote this book. So another questions, kind of jumping into new territory here, is I'm wondering what advice you have for students that are on the fence about leaving academia. And then along with this, for those students who do know that they want to leave, what advice do you have for them if they still need to push through and finish the dissertation, but they kind of got one foot out the door and need that motivation?
Yeah, those are two different questions. So let me take them in turn. I think first is just some statistical level setting. And at least in the humanities and social sciences, if you look at the people entering grad school, only about 7% of people who enter are going to get a tenure track job, or I should say, we're going to get a tenure track job prior to COVID. And so I think that now that number is significantly lower. So people who are on the fence about exploring other options, I would say first and foremost that academia cannot be your plan A. That just doesn't work, because for the vast majority of people, even at a fantastic school like Hopkins, it just is an unlikely outcome for the vast majority of people who go down that path. That doesn't mean that it can't happen. And of course, if you want to be a professor, you need to have a PhD. So there's that built into it as well. My view, though, is that as people are going through a graduate program, you need to think of being a professor as one option among many. And it might be a preference that you have, but again, it can't be the only one. Sorry, getting a little background noise there. Rachel, can you restate the second half of that question? Because I think that speaks to the first half.
Yes, definitely. So the second half is for students who do know they want to leave, but they still have a lot of work to do to finish up. Do you have any advice for sustaining that motivation to finish the dissertation? Somewhat of a selfish question, but I think others can definitely relate.
That really comes down to your personal circumstances and personal motivation. It will also come down to a question of whether you have funding and health insurance as part of your package or not. I think that for a lot of people who set out to get a PhD, they want to have those letters at the end of their name. They want to go by doctor. That is a perfectly good reason to consider forging ahead, as long as doing so isn't going to put you in some kind of financial jeopardy. If you have the means to do it, that's great. Go ahead and use that privilege to pursue something that you want to do. That's just fine. It's acceptable. On the other hand, I think if you are coming to realize that you might not want to be a professor and you aren't sure whether you should finish or not, you do need to do a certain amount of assessment of what is the return on investment going to be for the PhD in particular. If you've learned everything that you need to learn in your discipline to get a job in industry, especially if you're in the sciences or engineering, that might be okay and step away. My father-in-law actually, he did everything for his master's in engineering, nuclear engineering, except for finishing the thesis, and that was 40 years ago, and he had a very successful career in defense. So you can do that, you can be fine, you can be happy, and you can have a good life, and your children can be successful if you want to have kids. So that's fine. But again, you sort of need to look and say, what am I doing this for? What am I hoping to get out of it? And am I able to sustain the investment of time and of money that it takes to finish, if that isn't a path that you're going to go down? Rachel, you said you're in your 7th year. I mean, at this point, you may be pot committed, right? There's kind of no reason not to finish at that point if you're close enough. And so that could come into it too. But I do think that this is a reasonable question to ask, especially people in the humanities, in some of the social sciences where you may not be applying your area of expertise directly. Ask what that return is going to be. Does it make sense for you? Can you sustain it? And really feel that out for yourself and do what's best for you, and if you have one, for your family.
Yeah, I think that makes sense of kind of thinking about, what factors, how far are you in the program? How much work is there to go? Do you think you're going to need that degree for a job? Like you said, I think the sciences and social sciences can have a slightly different set of issues that they're looking at there. Great, thank you. So another question here is, what are the biggest mistakes that PhDs make when leaving academia? And likewise, what are some mistakes that you made transition out of academia?
Well, I put a lot of the mistakes that I made into the book, so they are there for everybody to see. I think one of the, if not the biggest mistake that a lot of academics make when venturing beyond their discipline is that they assume that other people should value what they do because they value it, or to the extent that they value it. And to my mind, it's really a mistake, excuse me, to think that anybody should care about what you do. If you go into a conversation thinking that they will care by default, you can kind of back yourself into a corner very, very quickly. What I recommend people do instead is to think about their experience, think about the skills that they have, and try to initially frame those things as valuable in terms that make sense to the person that they're speaking with. So if you're conducting an informational interview with somebody in business, you probably want to talk about how your skills do things like accelerate time to value, or can solve problems, or are good at project management. If you're speaking with somebody who's working for a nonprofit, you might not want to talk about value in those terms. You might want to talk about your ability to lead a discussion section or to teach a course with a diverse array of students from different backgrounds to get people with different interests aligned on a common goal. You really do need to approach conversations with a degree and applications with a degree of humility that people will not and shouldn't necessarily value what you do. It's really on you to explain to them why it matters and why it's worth their time. And I think that the sooner people can start doing that and practicing it and finding ways to communicate that as effectively as possible, the easier that career transition is going to go. And as a second aside to that, I think if you're really good at explaining to people in business and nonprofits and university administration and your own discipline why your research matters, you're probably going to have a better time communicating that in print for an academic audience as well. And that's going to make you a more effective teacher, scholar, and all the other things that you do as an academic.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, when I've written grant applications, you're trying to why what you're doing matters. And sometimes it's a challenge because you don't always think about it in those terms. So yeah, having these conversations with people outside academia really gets you thinking differently about your research.
And Rachel, if I can just stay on brand for a second and be really practical with this, what that means is that before you apply for a job or a grant, you should be going to the website and seeing what the mission is and making sure that you're tying what you do directly to the mission. If they have new initiatives being led by a chair, you should absolutely tie it to those, what you do to those initiatives as much as you can. If you don't know specifically what initiatives are going on, you should do a deeper layer of research. Find out who is on the board or who is hiring, and go to LinkedIn and find out what they do, what they have done, what they seem to care about. You can do a little bit of social media stalking to get a sense of what people are interested in, and actually start talking about what you do in things that you can make an educated guess they may have an interest in.
Yeah, well, I've noticed in my own research on companies that they always tend to have at least one thing that kind of sums up what they're about. Like they, are like a consulting firm that's like really quantitative based. Like that's kind of their selling point. And so really understanding what that is, I think, yeah, is so important. Let me ask another question that is jumping a bit to another point. But one thing you mentioned in your book is the utility of starting a career journal as students are thinking about transitioning out of academia. And I think this is great as sort of a practical thing that students can start doing now. So could you just tell us a little bit about what that is and what type of questions you might want to reflect on in a career journal?
So the career journal is really just a way to keep track of your thoughts about this process as you go on, essentially to capture your notes about how you really change how you feel about yourself as you go through this process, and a way to track things down. Rachel, as I said before the call, this was not actually something that I did myself. I was not smart enough to actually do that proactively when I was in the midst of this really crisis of identity about what I was going through. But since then, a number of people who I've spoken with have said, hey, for people who journal, this is a really effective way to help you process the things that you are feeling and thinking. It also gives you a record of conversations that you've had, of insights that you've had that you can go back to and mine to try to find patterns in what interests you and the rest. So really, I suggest this career journal as a way to give you a single physical space to think about issues related to your career change. And to take it up a level, at least when I was leaving, and I think this is true for a lot of academics, the big challenge that I had was that it wasn't just that I didn't know what I would do if I wasn't a professor. It was that I didn't know who I would be if I wasn't a professor. And this vocational aspect of the academy is so strong. I know people who've compared it to losing your faith or having a conversion in a religious sense. That something really essential to your identity is gone. And I think that because of that, there is a way in which sustained discernment and reflection is really, really helpful for people to figure out what is that story that you tell about yourself. I know we have a lot of engineers and scientists on the line. I don't necessarily mean this in a touchy-feely way, but in a really practical way. I mean, when you have your 20-second elevator pitch, that is a story that you are telling somebody about yourself. What is it? That story, if you are leaving the academy right now, is about to change a lot in the next few weeks and months and years. And having a way to think through what that is, to build on that, to refine it, having a space where that all resides can be incredibly helpful. Again, this is not a habit that I'm terribly good at, but the idea for that career journal came from the types of conversations that I was having with my wife, with my friends, with my parents and other people that helped me make sense of my career change in a way that allowed me to be successful.
Yeah, and I certainly find, writing really helps me think through things. Sometimes you can have some epiphanies just by writing out your thoughts. So I find that really helpful. Well, I think we can jump into our Q&A now. We've got a couple of pre-submitted questions I can ask, but for anyone who has questions, now would definitely be the time to start raising your hand or type them into the chat here. So I'll be keeping an eye on that. But let's start with our pre-submitted questions. So the first one is from an engineering student, which I mentioned because this can be a little bit different when you're looking at sort of sciences versus humanities. But the question is how do you go about converting your skill set into what's required in industry? And I think this question, it might be asking both about actually adding to your skill set by learning new skills and sort of presenting the skills you have for industry.
One of the things that we tend to do in going through a graduate program is that we are acculturated to talk about what we do with our colleagues as a way to mark out what section of our discipline we reside within. And so I think across disciplines, academics tend to talk about the details of what they do as almost a way of explaining kind of where they fit within their broader world, whether it's engineering or classics or history or anything else. And the problem with reflexively saying what you do as a way to communicate, or the details of what you do as a way to communicate kind of how you can bring value to an organization, is that you are assuming that your audience has the same level of education and expertise that you do in that subject matter. And some might, and if they do, you can probably go that route. But more often than not, they don't. And so when you are trying to translate your skills for a different audience, I always advise people to stop saying what you do and start saying how you do it. That is to say, instead of focusing on the details, focus on the methodology, explain how you approach problems, what types of challenges you're able to solve because of the tools and approaches that your discipline has taught you, and speak in as abstract terms as possible with as little jargon as possible. And if you can start doing that, you can actually start getting people's interest in the details pretty quickly. But if you lead with the details, it doesn't work. And if you'll indulge me for a second, an example might make this helpful for my own experience. So if I tell you all that I wrote a dissertation on a epic poem, a long narrative poem about the civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great that led to the fall of the Roman Republic, and it was written by a young boyhood friend of Nero 100 years after the events, who was implicated in a conspiracy to kill the emperor and forced to commit suicide. And this poem is very confusing and messy, and I wrote an awful lot about how the language of the poem is trying to instill feelings of confusion and anxiety in you as a reader. Show of hands, I mean, how many people care? Probably none of you. Yeah, I see no raised hands, assuming that functionality it's there, which is exactly right, because you all don't know the first thing about this. It's not actually a terribly effective way to communicate to people who don't have a PhD in classics, and even to people who haven't studied my subdiscipline. Instead, I think what you can do is say, I studied how language has an emotional impact on readers. And I was particularly interested in how narratives of the past make people feel about their common cultural traditions. And so really what I do is I study how language affects emotion. And if you want to know what I do every day as a communication strategist and sales professional, is I use language to create emotions in people who are getting ready to write very big checks to my company instead of our competitors' companies. How many of you are interested now? Hopefully a few. The difference there is that I've gone up a level, and I've told you sort of methodologically how I do my job instead of the details of what it is. That tends to be the most effective path forward.
What I love about that example is you're showing how you can still, if it's something that comes up in a conversation, you can still talk about your research, but in a way that makes it relevant. Because I think a lot of us feel like we need to be like, oh yeah, I'm doing a dissertation, but forget about that. Let's talk about something else. But that if you can talk about it in the right way, you can actually make the research itself kind of interesting and relevant in a discussion. So I find that example super interesting.
And people may well ask for the details once you've enticed them in this way. And so that is kind of nice. You can actually get somebody interested in the thing that interests you if you are disciplined about not leading with the details. And this also gets back to what I was saying before, which is that if you are having conversations like this with non-academics, if you're speaking with people who don't know what you're doing, you can get much better at saying what is the point of your research, because you're not getting lost in the forest.
Yeah. And I've tried a tactic. I don't know if I learned this from Roshni or where, but it was, mentioning your dissertation in terms like you did and pretty quickly, and say, if you have any more questions, like I'd be happy to talk about it more. And then, moving on to whatever next thing. And sometimes you'll get an interviewer or someone you're talking to with an informational interview, and they're like, oh, that is interesting. I do have questions. So you give them a little bit, but not too much, and open up the chance to talk about it more. Thanks. So let's go to the next pre-submitted question here. So how did you identify non-academic opportunities that fit your interests and expertise?
Really, it was through informational interviewing. And I spoke with as many people as I could, whether I found them through friends, through other contacts, through LinkedIn, and just reached out blindly, who were doing things that looked even remotely interesting to me. And I asked them for 30 to 60 minutes just to find out what that was. And in the course of doing this for the better part of year, 18 months, in a really intensive way, I began to zero in on communication strategy as a discipline and as a type of job that I was really quite interested in. And I had no idea that this was a job that existed when I started. I certainly didn't know that my current job, writing proposals where I essentially need to translate technical details for a business audience, was something that existed or that I could be good at it. But by speaking with people, I was slowly able to zero in on something that became a really good and natural fit for me. But it's almost this this process of elimination where you need to go out and just speak to as many people as you can, and you start realizing what interests you, what doesn't, where can you stop paying attention, and you kind of zero in and meet people in that way. And it's not a very clear-cut process, I'm sorry to say, but there is this weird feeling of clarity or momentum that happens when you're starting to talk to people who are getting more excited to hear about your background because you're getting better at conveying it, and are introducing you to more of their contacts or referring you for jobs. That's usually how you know when things are going right, is people start saying, oh, I know somebody you should talk to. And that usually indicates that they've spotted something you'd be good at.
Yeah, and then you kind of build your network from there. One thing I found interesting, and that's why I think like keeping a career journal is useful, is when you find those opportunities that seem really interesting to you, like a job description that seems really interesting, and sort of keeping track of that. and then, like you mentioned, kind of seeing some of the patterns in what interests you over time. Great. So looks like we've got some questions in the chat box. So we've got a question from Mary Favre. So is there a value, do you think, in writing and finishing a long-term research project, such as a dissertation, in the world outside the academy?
That is going to depend on what you go on to do. Certainly in my role right now, nobody cares that I wrote a dissertation. At the same time, it was writing my dissertation that instilled in me a very disciplined approach to understanding language and culture and the polyvalent aspect of language and how things can could have different meanings depending on how somebody reads them. That was all very helpful for me. So I have one person who I interviewed for the book, Patricia Soler. She currently works as an IT program lead for housing and urban development, although she started out with a PhD in Spanish and Portuguese literature. Okay, and what she said is that department, because it was founded reasonably recently and was founded at a time when not everybody went to college, they end up having some people in leadership who only had a high school diploma. If you go into that setting and your bosses have a high school diploma and no college, and you're waving around your dissertation and your PhD, that's probably not going to help you. On the other hand, if you end up working in an area tangential to biomed, say, doing something that is research-based, that is still potentially a writing role, and you've produced this thing that shows that you know how to think, and you're in a context where that is not going to offend people, but is going to carry weight, then that could be helpful. But it really does depend quite a lot on where you end up. And I don't, based on experience and discussions with other people, you usually don't know where you're going to end up. And so if you think you want to finish that project because it matters to you, keep doing it and keep your eyes peeled for outside opportunities, but don't think there's going to be a direct correlation. And it may be that you do finish it and you end up in an area like Patricia where it's just better not to mention it all that often. And you can't really control for that, but you will still learn things along the way, and it can be valuable as long as you're attentive to what they are.
So we've got a question that kind of gets more about the emotional aspects of this journey. So leaving academia feels to many people that they're like giving something up, and you see that in the term like leaving, or that they're disappointing their mentors. Is that something you felt too in the process? And how did you work through it?
Oh, 100%. 100% I felt that. One of the things that I was doing while I was a visiting assistant professor as a service opportunity was supporting first what was called non-tenure track faculty issues and then contingent faculty issues for my professional society. And as I did that work and came to hear stories of what professors were actually living like day to day, especially adjunct professors, and what the real job outcomes were in my discipline of classics and across the board, it just became clear to me that leaving is actually the normal state of affairs for most people. That's just how it goes. And this idea that somehow you're supposed to keep doing this, that just isn't right, and it's never been. But I do know that the culture is there. It feels, it doesn't feel right. And the concern about advisors is real too. Well, I'm in a position now where I can say this freely because I can't be dinged for it. But I would actually challenge any advisor who's telling you that leaving academia is a failure The number I gave before is that 93% of people do not get tenure track jobs. So if that advisor is really only interested in helping 7% of the students that see them, I would say that they are not a very good advisor, they are not a very good mentor, and they are not, frankly, doing their job. So again, that doesn't necessarily help you in that moment, but I think it's important to remember that that is in some ways a failing of theirs. It's not a failing of yours. And I've just been shocked to see how many people who have left academia are so eager to help people who are still there, because we all know that emotion that you're describing. And it's weird. Once the spell is broken, you sort of don't know how you ever fell into it, but you did, and it will take time to break free of it. All I can say is that the more you speak to people who've left, and the more you educate yourself on what the statistics are like and what the outcomes are like and what life really looks like day to day for professors, and that isn't always the good job that it's said to be, even if it's a tenure track position, that can help you move past that. There may still be some hurt feelings on both sides, but that may be inevitable.
I think it's interesting you mentioned this sort of like being under a spell, because when you spend several years in one program with the same people, the same advisor, that is sort of like, like it feels like the end all be all is like not disappointing those people. And I think once you're out of that, even if you moved on to a tenure track job, I think the way we feel now in a program it's going to be behind us. I don't think it'll feel that important anymore after some time. So I think that's something.
And an advisor may not be excuse me. An advisor may not be the best person to be a reference for a job anyway. They've basically seen you do this one narrow part of your life, which other jobs may not be all that interested in. So you might be better off finding a student that you had a good relationship with, who can speak to how you were able to convey information clearly, how you were able to help them problem solve, how you were able to adapt when a hurricane forced a change in your schedule. There are any number of things that they could speak to. But I think very often that idea that you can't disappoint your advisor comes up because you know that you are beholden to them for a reference. And if you are leaving the academy, you may well not be. And so that power dynamic in a way just disappears. And when it does, you have a great deal more freedom to pursue other things without fear of penalty, because there's very little that they can actually do to punish you at that point.
That's a good point. Do you have any other questions, either if someone wants to come off mute and ask, or throw something into the chat box? Maybe the time I've got some other things we can discuss, but I thought I'd give a moment if people want to, if anyone's got a question. Well, let's see. Okay, as I give it time, let me, I've got another question that kind of looks at more of the personal life dynamic of all of this. So we know that there's certain ways having a partner can help the process, mostly in providing with financial stability. But how does having a partner or a family add to the challenges of leaving academia? And for those who experienced, how did you work through those challenges?
My wife is still an academic, and we came up in the same field. So we had the two-body problem, and she had to witness my entire departure from academia close at hand. And, asking about the challenges, I think for her, it was hard because she was the main person that I turned to work through all of these different issues. And this is another benefit of having a career journal, is that if you have a partner, you don't need to rely on them 100% the way I did, and really tick them off sometimes, that you won't go to somebody else to talk through some of these challenges. But I know that was taxing on her. When I was really in the thick of doing informational interviews, trying to have 2 or 3 meetings a week, I was volunteering, I was taking night classes, my schedule got really busy, so I had less time with her. And very often when when I did have time with her, I was so tired from doing all these things that I was doing that I was not my best self, and could be irritable and things like that, which is not really how you want to go to your spouse. So you do need to be, I think, thoughtful about the fact that this person is your partner. They're going to be walking this path with you, but they don't necessarily need to be privy to all of the details, and they may not want to be. And you should be good about communicating with them about how much information they do want and what they can tolerate, and actually listen if they tell you to talk to somebody else about what you're going through. That was tough. One of the other things is that we really thought in grad school that it would be great to get jobs in the same place, have lunch together every day, be in the same department. And we actually had that for 3 years, our first 3 years of marriage. And it ended up not being all it was cracked up to be. We didn't really have anything to talk about when we got home at the end of the day. And especially as I was leaving academia, when I was not in a great psychological state, and it was stressful for me to even go on campus, aware of this fact that I was still a part of this community, but was leaving it, but hadn't left yet. It's kind of a horrible liminal space. And she began to pick up on my stress, and she said it started to get difficult for her to go into the office and do her job because she was constantly concerned about how I was feeling when I was there. And because she could hear me taking calls in the office next door, that would often kind of have her worried about me in a way that I didn't want her to be, but that she couldn't help. That was her reflex. So I don't know if this is really addressing the main thrust of that question, but I think that I could have been a lot better about managing myself so that I could have been a better partner to my wife, because she bore the brunt of a lot of this. But I will say that since I've left academia, our relationship actually got stronger and healthier and better because we do have different things that we're doing during the day. My new ways of thinking and exposure to new ideas led her to think about her teaching differently, and she even founded a nonprofit that has benefited from discussions with me about how to think about how they pitch their message to potential donors, to people interested in their programs. We actually support one another a lot better now than we did before, and that is not an outcome we could have anticipated.
Yeah, thanks for your honesty with this question. This reminds me actually a bit of just in when you're contemplating leaving academia or in the process of it, and you're talking with people, whether it's friends, a partner, et cetera, that are committed to academia. I do sometimes find this dynamic that can be difficult because you're maybe unhappy with something that they are happy about. And so it's like, you talk about that thing without making them feel like maybe they should be considering it too, so there's this interesting dynamic. And sometimes I found that it is helpful to have a friend or two that, feels the same way about leaving academia, that you can just kind of talk about all the things with and not kind of worry about that dynamic. So it can be helpful to have, multiple outlets, I think. Excellent. We have another question that's come through, which is, do you see any differences between leaving academia straight after the PhD versus after a few years as a postdoc?
Within the humanities, postdocs are rare, and we tend to have what are known as visiting assistant professorships, which are short terminal positions of 1 to 3 years, at the end of which you're let go no matter what. But there's less of a mentoring relationship, as I understand it, in a VAP than there is with a postdoc. So that's a little bit of a tricky dynamic for me to balance. I think what I would say is that I benefited a lot from the 3 years when I was postdoctorate, when I was teaching, because I was making up my own courses. I was actually a member of a profession. I was responsible for a lot more. When I think about the stories that I would tell people and how I would translate my experience in terms that were relevant to them, a lot of that did come from this period when I just had more teaching going on, more publications able to come out, just because that I wasn't bogged down with coursework and you know, the difficulties of a dissertation. So I think for me, it was really helpful to have that. But I want to temper that by saying that had I done my PhD when you all are doing your PhD, and had there been more resources available to think through some of these issues of professionalization and diverse careers, I may have been able to pursue things earlier on that would have made that shift just as easy, or maybe we'll say no more hard. That's probably the better way to put it, if I'd come straight out. I know that's a really bad and vague answer, but so much of this is about learning how to translate your experience. And it took me a few extra years to have enough experience to translate and to learn how to do it. But if you start earlier, you should presumably have the same result on an accelerated timescale.
Let's see, we've got a question related to advisors.
Uh-oh.
So, okay, if you have an advisor who's not supportive of non-academic careers, do you have advice about doing a job search kind of under the radar? Looks like this. Oh yeah, so it looks like this person had to leave for a bit when their boss walked in. So I think you know, there's you know, various levels of support, and I think some people feel like their advisor actively would be unhappy, and so how you kind of manage that.
That is just a tough situation, and if you are dependent on that person's approval for maintaining your stipend and your health insurance in the short term, then you are going to have to at least maintain appearances that you are forging ahead on the academic path. That is unfortunate, but the state of things is such that's probably how it's going to be. So that's too bad. What I'll say is that I did keep my non-academic career search quite secret for the first probably 6 to 12 months that I was doing it. I initially began doing some informational interviews with people in university administration. I went to one person who I trusted at Tulane, where I was teaching at the time. I asked if she knew anybody because she had a position that put her in touch with a lot of administrators, and kind of swore her to secrecy on this. And she agreed, and she put me in touch with people who would maintain confidence. And I began speaking with them. And none of those positions ended up being things that I decided to pursue, but it at least gave me an idea of what else might be out there and let me feel like I was beginning to take my future into my own hands for the first time in a long time, instead of an advisor's. And it was only later, when I had decided that I was going to leave, and that you know, again, because I was on a contract that gave me some time, that I could declare I was leaving and know that I would be okay. And that's kind of when I accelerated those efforts and actually began scaling back the amount of time that I spent on my academic pursuits in order to prioritize these other activities. But I know that those advisors do exist. I'm sorry to whoever asked the question that that's what you're living with and dealing with right now. The other way to go about it is to start putting pressure on them through your department, through your chair, potentially even through the dean, to start acknowledging the fact that most people who enter a PhD are not going to be tenure track professors, and get them to, or at least try to push through back channels for the department to host events that are going to make this something that advisor has to confront as not just a real possibility, but as a successful outcome for people who have a PhD, and try to go that way. But it is tough, and yeah, the culture is changing, but not quite fast enough. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Thanks for that response. I've got a question about your volunteer experience. So Jessica would like to know if you can talk more about your volunteer experience and how that helped you pivot out of academia.
I ended up, to build new skills, I was really throwing spaghetti at the wall, doing every single thing that I could to just do something different so that my resume wouldn't look solely academic. The volunteering experience that I had consisted of two things primarily. The first is that I was on the finance committee of a small nonprofit. I had no business being on the finance committee for a nonprofit, but I'd taken a night course in finance. I became friends with a professor who was only 2 years older than I was, and he was the chair of the board for that nonprofit and said, why don't you come and get some experience this way? So this was a case in which networking really allowed me to get an opportunity. And what that did was it allowed me to hear how the qualified members of the committee thought about the finances of an organization. How were they planning to sustain operations? What were they dealing with when, how did they respond when the one source of revenue that they had, the primary source of revenue that they had, which was a campus where they could house volunteers at a small fee, was knocked out by a tornado. I mean, that was a real challenge that we had to address, and hearing how people thought through those problems was extremely valuable. And I am not going to go and do something finance related again, but it was really helpful to get that perspective and to learn how those conversations happen. I'm not as lost when I hear people doing it now, even though I couldn't contribute all that much besides some connections to a few people who could have been useful. The other volunteering opportunity that I had was to join the board of a small educational nonprofit in New Orleans, which basically brings a classical Christian education to students in one of the poorer areas of the city. And I was brought into that again through networking. Somebody who I'd met introduced me to the executive director. She initially wanted me writing curricula for 5 to 11-year-olds, which I, again, wasn't qualified to do, even if it was classics based. But in joining this nonprofit, that was running at a massive budget to serve a very small number of people and kind of struggling to get by initially, I was able to kind of take that other experience and learn how to help focus the executive director and the board and the organization on that core mission. And over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, we've actually scaled back our operations considerably and refocused on that central mission. And I was able to build this experience of helping to help an entity that was really struggling financially to right the ship, and then to start building out intellectual property that we can begin using to grow again. And these were not experiences I expected to have as a guy who read Latin poetry for a job. It just, it wasn't there. But what I would say is that I put myself out there to hold volunteering positions where I knew I could learn new skills, where I would be forced to confront new challenges, and where there were other people already established who could help me find a way forward in that chaos. And you don't need to be swinging a hammer with Habitat for Humanity to volunteer. You can ask to support the social media profile of a nonprofit that you think is doing good work as a way to learn about managing social media profiles online. You can ask to work with the finance department so you can learn bookkeeping. Most nonprofits are going to say, yes, if you will work for free, we will gladly have you. And you can be upfront with the fact that you're trying to build new skills once you know what they are.
Great. So we've got like 2 more questions on, but only a couple more minutes. I'll ask the one that's more general first. So this is from Alyssa, who mentions that she took your Rise of Rome course as an undergrad at Tulane.
Oh my God.
So she says the academic community has a reputation for being quite insular. So did you find it especially difficult to network and find new contacts outside of academia?
No. The short answer is no. I would say about 80% of the people who I contacted, either through an existing contact or just out of the blue, said, yes, I will meet with you. People really want to help. It is a peculiar fact of academia that people who are literally paid on payroll to have time to think about big ideas say that they have no time, whereas people in business who are expected to count every minute make lots and lots of time to network. And all you need to do is ask, and people will almost always say yes. If they don't say yes, don't take it personally. People do have lots of things going on, but usually even very busy people will find a way to meet and chat.
Great. Okay, so for one last question, I've got a question from Sunyan, who's asking about whether or not, so if you're in like the second year of a postdoc or near the end of a program and you want to leave academia, is it worth waiting to finish the project you're working on and get a publication or not?
If it's just about getting a publication and you don't think that you're going into a line of work that is related to your area of expertise, I would say no. The one exception to that is that if you are on a research team and other people's success is depending on you sticking around, you may want to consider sticking it out so that you don't also put them in a difficult position. But really it's going to depend on the type of work that you are looking for. If you're in the sciences or engineering and that publication could help you get a job with a pharma company or an engineering firm, then that might be worth doing by all means. But for me, having another article on the poet Lucan is not going to help me in business writing. So there was not a whole lot of compelling reason to turn my dissertation into a book, and I haven't done so.
Great. All right. Well, that's all the questions. Perfect timing. So we're done. Well, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for your attendance and for your questions. This was really great.